Picture this, it's the year 1400. While Europeans are crawling out from under the shadow of the Black Death, while Constantinople's walls are crumbling before Ottoman cannons, while the Renaissance is just beginning to stir in Italian city-states, something remarkable is happening in the American Southwest. Groups of people are moving south, following ancient pathways through mountains and deserts, carrying with them knowledge that will make them the undisputed masters of one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. These are the Apache peoples. Not one tribe, but many. Think of them as different chapters in the same incredible survival manual, each one perfectly adapted to their chosen homeland. The Chiricahua claimed the mountain strongholds, where eagles nested and snow lingered even in summer heat. The Mescalero made their home among the sacred peaks that caught the first light of dawn. The Western Apache settled the river valleys, where cottonwoods provided shade and water ran year-round. The Jicarilla took the northern ranges, where pine forests met endless sky. And the Lipan spread across the eastern plains, where buffalo herds thundered and horizons stretched beyond imagination. Now, when I say they were adapted to these lands, I don't mean they just got by. I mean they became part of the landscape itself. Every hidden spring that meant the difference between life and death in a land where summer temperatures regularly hit 120 degrees. They knew it. Every edible plant that could sustain a family when game was scarce. They could find it in the dark. Every animal trail that wound through canyons and mesas. They had memorized it like you know the hallways of your own home. This was survival, elevated to an art form. Apache children learned to run 50 miles without stopping, not jog, run, across terrain that would challenge modern hiking boots. They learned to find water in apparent wasteland by reading the flight patterns of birds, the color of distant rock, the behavior of insects. They learned to move through deserts so thick with thorns it looked like nature's own barbed wire, and do it silently, invisibly, like ghosts made of wind and shadow. But here's what makes their story even more fascinating. While Europeans were obsessing over accumulating wealth, building bigger castles, hoarding gold and land, Apache society was built on the exact opposite principle. Chiefs earned respect not by what they could gather, but by what they could give away. Generosity was power. The leader who shared the most, who made sure everyone in the band had what they needed, who gave away horses and weapons and food until his own family had barely enough, that was the man people followed into battle. And speaking of battle, let's talk about Apache warriors for a moment. These weren't just tough guys with weapons. This was an entire military culture refined over generations. Young men trained from childhood not just in fighting, but in the kind of mental discipline that would make a Navy SEAL pause and take notes. They learned to endure pain without flinching, to go days without water, to navigate by stars and wind and the smell of distant rain. They developed tactics that would later confound professional armies, appearing and disappearing like desert lightning, striking hard and fast. Then vanishing into landscape they knew better than their enemies knew their own backyard. The women held equal status in this warrior culture, particularly during the sacred sunrise ceremony. For 4 days and nights, young Apache women didn't just celebrate becoming adults, they literally became changing woman herself, the most powerful figure in Apache spirituality. They embodied the renewal of all life, the eternal cycle of seasons, the connection between human beings and the sacred landscape they called home. Watching one of these ceremonies, you'd understand that Apache culture wasn't just about survival. It was about thriving in perfect harmony with forces that could destroy the unprepared. By 1500, while Spanish conquistadors were stumbling around the southwest looking for golden cities that existed only in their fevered imaginations, Apache raiders had become something unprecedented in North American warfare. They had developed what you might call a sustainable economy of conflict. Think about that phrase, sustainable conflict. They took livestock, goods and supplies from Spanish settlements, but they did it carefully, strategically. They never completely destroyed their targets, because that would eliminate future sources of wealth. It was like farming, except they were harvesting horses and cattle and trade goods instead of corn and beans. The Spanish colonists, the supposedly tough conquistadors who had toppled empires, learned to pay tribute to Apache bands rather than face their wrath. Let that sink in for a moment. The people who had conquered the Aztec and Inca empires were paying protection money to desert warriors who fought with bows and arrows and lived in temporary shelters that could be packed up and moved in an hour. The name Apache itself tells you everything about how their enemies viewed them. It probably comes from the Zuni word for enemy, though some scholars think it derives from other regional languages meaning to fight or warriors. By the time Spanish record keepers were writing it down, Apache had become synonymous with fear. They were the desert lightning that struck without warning. They were the smoke that cleared to reveal empty corrals and missing horses. They were the nightmare that kept frontier settlements barricaded behind walls after sunset. But here's what those Spanish chronicles miss, what those fear-soaked reports fail to capture. Apache peoples weren't just raiders and warriors. They were master engineers of survival in a landscape that killed unprepared travelers within days. They were botanists who knew which plants healed wounds and which ones filled empty bellies when game was scarce. They were hydrologists who could find water sources by reading subtle changes in vegetation patterns. They were astronomers who navigated by stars across hundreds of miles of seemingly identical desert. They were psychologists who understood that true leadership meant service to others, not dominance over them. By the early 1600s, Apache bands controlled territory from the Colorado River to the Rio Grande, from the mountains of New Mexico down into the deserts of northern Mexico. They had created what amounted to their own empire, except it wasn't built on cities and roads and permanent settlements. It was built on mobility, knowledge, and an intimate relationship with the land that went back generations. They were the lords of the burning desert, rulers of a kingdom measured not in square miles, but in survival skills passed from parent to child like precious heirlooms. And they were about to face challenges that would test every one of those skills, every alliance they had forged, every lesson their ancestors had learned about enduring in an unforgiving world. Because far to the east, beyond the horizons they knew, a new kind of enemy was building. Ships and loading muskets and dreaming dreams of expansion that would make Spanish colonization look like a gentle suggestion. The Apache nations at the height of their power in the early 1600s had no way of knowing that their greatest trials still lay ahead. They had mastered the desert, outlasted the Spanish, and created a way of life perfectly adapted to their harsh but beloved homeland. They were about to discover that sometimes survival skills that work perfectly in one era become woefully inadequate when the entire world changes around you. But that's a story for tomorrow, when we'll witness the collision between Apache ways and American ambitions, when we'll see what happens when eagles fight the Iron Horse. Everything changed in 1846. American victory in the Mexican War brought a fundamentally different kind of enemy to Apache lands, one that counted westward expansion as divine destiny and possessed what seemed like unlimited soldiers, supplies, and iron determination. Where Spanish and Mexican settlers had eventually learned to accommodate Apache power, to pay tribute and respect boundaries, Americans arrived with a completely different mindset. They demanded total submission. Nothing less would satisfy them. Think about the scale of what was happening here. For over 2 centuries, Apache peoples had dealt with colonizers who wanted specific things: silver mines, trade routes, grazing land for cattle. These conflicts were manageable because they had limits. But now they faced a nation that wanted everything. Every square mile, every water source, every mountain pass, every blade of grass. And they justified this total conquest with a phrase that would echo through Apache nightmares: manifest destiny. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 turned Apache territory into a highway of invasion. Wagon trains began crossing their lands like a parade of provocations. Each convoy wasn't just trespassing. It was bringing diseases, disrupting delicate water sources, hunting out game that Apache families depended on for survival, and leaving a trail of garbage and graves that marked permanent ecological disruption. But perhaps the most devastating change was in the quality of leadership on both sides. The Americans weren't sending administrators who might negotiate. They were sending military commanders trained in total war against equals, men who had learned their trade fighting Mexicans and who saw Apache resistance as simply another problem to be solved with overwhelming force. Enter Mangus Coloradas, whose very name, Red Sleeves, had struck fear into Spanish hearts for decades. This towering Membrano Apache chief, standing nearly 6.5 feet tall in an era when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, initially tried the old ways with these new enemies. He signed treaties. He attempted diplomacy. He even guided American troops through his territory when he thought cooperation might protect his people. Then came 1861, and an incident that would transform the Southwest into a charnel house. American miners discovered Mangus Coloradas protesting their invasion of sacred land near Santa Rita. These weren't soldiers bound by military codes of conduct. These were prospectors driven by gold fever and contempt for anyone standing between them and wealth. They tied the 60-year-old chief to a tree and whipped him like a common criminal. Imagine that scene for a moment. Here was a man who had never been defeated in battle, who commanded the respect of thousands of warriors, who had negotiated as an equal with Spanish governors and Mexican officials. And American miners, not even government representatives, just civilians driven by greed, stripped him, bound him, and humiliated him in front of his own people. The whipping lasted until Mangus Coloradas's back was shredded and bloody. But something far more dangerous than flesh was wounded that day. The transformation from diplomat to implacable enemy was instantaneous and complete. The old chief who had sought accommodation with Americans died under those lashes. What emerged was a strategist bent on total war. Mangus Coloradas wasn't alone in learning hard lessons about American character. His son-in-law, Cochise of the Chiricahua, experienced his own moment of clarity at Apache Pass in 1861. Lieutenant George Bascom, operating on questionable intelligence, accused Cochise of kidnapping a rancher's child and demanded he return the boy during what was supposed to be a peaceful meeting. When Cochise truthfully denied involvement, Bascom attempted to seize him as a hostage. Cochise escaped, slashing through the side of Bascom's tent with a knife and fleeing into rocks where cavalry horses couldn't follow. But his brother and 2 nephews weren't so fortunate. Bascom hanged them from a makeshift gallows, their bodies left swaying in the desert wind as a message to any Apache who might consider resistance. That message was received, but not in the way Bascom intended. Cochise's response launched 10 years of vengeance that would see hundreds of Americans die and entire stretches of Arizona. Territory abandoned by everyone except the most determined or most foolish settlers. Before we dive back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Americans responded to Apache resistance with industrial warfare on a scale the Southwest had never seen. General James Carleton issued orders that would have made Spanish conquistadors pause, kill all Apache men wherever found. No prisoners, no negotiations, extermination. Kit Carson, the famous frontiersman who had guided John Fremont's expeditions and earned a reputation as someone who understood Indian ways, accepted the brutal logic of Carleton's campaign. Carson systematically destroyed Apache food supplies, burned their shelters, poisoned water sources, and turned the desert itself into a weapon against its former masters. Technology was shifting the balance in ways that pure warrior skill couldn't overcome. The new Spencer repeating rifles eliminated Apache advantages in accuracy and mobility. Where Apache warriors had once been able to reload faster than soldiers, now Americans could fire 7 shots to every one. Telegraph lines allowed coordination of simultaneous attacks from multiple forts scattered across Apache territory. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, meant unlimited reinforcements and supplies could reach Arizona territory faster than Apache runners could carry warnings between bands. By 1870, the mathematics of warfare had become terrifyingly simple. 3,000 Apache warriors faced a nation of 40 million Americans who had just demonstrated their capacity for total war by burning their way through the Confederacy. Apache advantages in knowledge of terrain and guerrilla tactics were being overwhelmed by sheer industrial capacity, yet still they fought, and their resistance produced military leaders whose tactical brilliance would be studied in war colleges decades later. Victorio, the Warm Springs chief who combined Mangus Coloradus's strategic mind with Cochise's ability to disappear into landscape, led campaigns that humiliated professional armies. His warriors would strike simultaneously at points hundreds of miles apart, creating the illusion of Apache forces everywhere and nowhere. The ancient warrior Nana became a legend that haunted American nightmares. Nearly 80 years old, riding with bullets in his body from decades of warfare, Nana led 1,000-mile raids that left pursuing cavalry exhausted and broken, while he seemed to gain strength from the chase. American officers reported that tracking Nana was like chasing a ghost mounted on wind. And then there was Geronimo. Originally known as Goyacla, he had been a medicine man and family man, someone who healed rather than killed. But Mexican soldiers changed all that when they murdered his mother, wife, and 3 children during what was supposed to be a peaceful trading expedition to Llanos in 1850. The transformation from healer to the most feared name in the Southwest embodied Apache determination. To resist at any cost, Geronimo's raids weren't just military operations. They were acts of spiritual vengeance carried out by someone who understood that he was fighting not just for territory or livestock, but for the right of Apache peoples to exist at all. When American newspapers wrote breathless accounts of Geronimo's latest raid, they were documenting the death throes of a way of life that had flourished in the desert for centuries. By the 1880s, Apache military resistance was clearly doomed, but Geronimo and his diminishing band of followers had achieved something remarkable. They had forced the American government to deploy over 5,000 soldiers, 1/4 of the entire United States Army, to hunt down fewer than 40 Apache warriors. They had made the name Apache synonymous with courage in the face of impossible odds. They had ensured that their people's story would be remembered not as victims, but as warriors who never stopped fighting for their homeland, but even warriors who could outrun cavalry horses and disappear into desert landscapes, couldn't outrun the grinding machinery of American expansion forever. The final surrender was coming, and with it, a different kind of warfare would begin, one fought not with rifles and raids, but with the far more insidious weapons of forced assimilation and cultural destruction. September 3rd, 1886. Skeleton Canyon, Arizona Territory. After decades of warfare that had consumed thousands of lives and millions of dollars, Geronimo walked into General Nelson Miles's camp and surrendered for the final time. The terms seemed honorable enough. Temporary exile to Florida for 2 years, then returned to Arizona. The old medicine man, now 57 years old and bearing scars from countless battles, shook hands with Miles and believed he was securing his people's survival. Instead, Apache families found themselves herded onto prison trains, bound for destinations that might as well have been on another planet. First Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida, where Spanish walls built to keep out English pirates now contained desert people who had never seen an ocean. Then Fort Pickens on a barrier island where the humidity was so thick you could drink. It and Apache children developed lung infections from air that felt like breathing underwater. The government moved them again to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, where yellow fever and malaria killed Apache warriors who had survived decades of cavalry charges and army campaigns. These were people whose spirituality was tied to specific mountains and sacred springs, who believed their ancestors dwelled in particular canyons and mesas. Now they found themselves in swamps and forests that contained no familiar landmarks, no recognizable plants, no connection to anything that had sustained their souls for generations. But here's where the story takes a turn that cuts deeper than any cavalry saber or government betrayal. In these prisons designed to break Apache spirits, an unexpected and devastating revelation occurred. 3 times daily, prison guards brought meals that would have been considered feasts in their homeland. Picture Chihuahua, the Chiricahua war chief who had ridden with Geronimo through the final campaigns, staring down at his full plate in the mess hall at Mount Vernon Barracks. Beef stew thick with vegetables he'd never seen before. Fresh bread with butter, actual butter, something most Apache people had experienced maybe once or twice in their entire lives. Beans cooked with salt pork, canned fruits from places thousands of miles away, coffee sweetened with real sugar. On Sundays, even pies and cakes that seemed like food from dreams. Chihuahua spoke words that would haunt Apache memory for generations. I have never eaten this well in my entire life. Think about the devastating irony contained in that simple statement. Here was a man who had been free to roam territories the size of European countries, who had commanded hundreds of warriors, who had struck fear into the hearts of professional armies. He had lived the life his ancestors had perfected over centuries, following game migrations, gathering seasonal plants, taking what they needed from enemies through skill and courage. And he was telling anyone who would listen that he ate better as a prisoner than he ever had as a free man. This wasn't just about food. This was about the collision between 2 completely different economic systems. Apache peoples had lived in what we might call a subsistence economy, taking what they needed from the land and from raids, sharing everything within the band, accumulating nothing because mobility was survival. The American industrial economy that captured them produced abundance beyond Apache imagination, but it came with chains attached. Every meal became a reminder of dependence. Every full belly was bought with a piece of Apache independence. The guards didn't need whips or shackles when they had 3 square meals a day and warm barracks in winter. The abundance of food became a golden chain more effective than iron in keeping Apache people bound to their captors. While their bodies grew strong on regular meals, many Apache prisoners actually gained weight during their captivity. Their spirits withered like desert plants transplanted to alien soil. Of the 500 Apache prisoners sent to Florida and Alabama, nearly 200 died within 3 years. Tuberculosis and malaria, unknown in their dry homeland, ravaged immune systems weakened not by hunger, but by despair. The psychological warfare was even more devastating than the physical toll. Children were stripped from their parents and sent to places like Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, where their hair was cut short, their language forbidden, and they were fed white bread and milk until they forgot the taste of acorn stew and prickly pear fruit. The abundance of American food became a weapon of cultural destruction, replacing traditional foods that connected Apache children to their heritage with processed substitutes that tied them to American civilization. Geronimo himself experienced this culinary captivity in the most public way imaginable. By the early 1900s, he had become a reluctant celebrity, appearing at events like the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. Thousands of Americans paid to see the last Apache warrior selling photographs and signing autographs for quarters and dollars. Between performances, fair organizers fed him restaurant meals that cost more than most Apache families had ever seen in cash. But even while enjoying prime rib and hotel desserts, Geronimo was secretly planning one last escape back to the Dragoon Mountains he would never see again. He dictated his autobiography to explain Apache ways to a world that had conquered but never understood them, describing the old life of freedom and simplicity while eating from plates of imported china in rooms with electric lights. The old medicine man understood better than anyone the trap that American abundance represented. In his autobiography, he wrote about the traditional Apache way of sharing everything within the band, of chiefs who gained respect by giving away wealth rather than accumulating it. Now he was surrounded by more material wealth than any Apache chief had ever possessed. But he was powerless to share it with his people, scattered across government schools and reservations. Other Apache leaders experienced their own revelations about American abundance. Women who had spent their lives grinding mesquite beans into flour and gathering wild plants marveled at government commissaries stocked with canned goods from across the continent. Warriors who had risked their lives raiding for horses and cattle found themselves eating better meat as prisoners than they had ever captured in raids. The psychological impact was profound and lasting. When these Apache prisoners were finally allowed to settle on reservations, many carried with them a complicated relationship with American food that their children and grandchildren would inherit. They had learned that abundance was possible, but only at the cost of freedom. They had discovered that full bellies didn't necessarily mean full lives. The feast in the House of Enemies had taught Apache peoples lessons that no amount of military defeat could have conveyed. They learned that their traditional economy of sharing and mobility had been replaced by an economy of dependence and accumulation. They learned that American abundance came with invisible chains stronger than any physical restraints. Most devastatingly, they learned that survival might require accepting those chains, but they also learned something their captors never intended them to discover. If abundance was possible in prison camps and government schools, it might also be possible on their own terms, under their own control. The question that would define the next century of Apache history was simple. Could they find ways to enjoy the feast without remaining forever in the House of Enemies? That question would drive Apache peoples to innovations their warrior ancestors could never have imagined, forcing them to become something entirely new while somehow remaining authentically Apache. As the 20th century dawned, with electric lights illuminating American cities and automobiles beginning to replace horses on city streets, Apache peoples faced a choice that would determine whether they survived as distinct cultures or vanished into the great American melting pot. Some, like Geronimo in his final years, became reluctant symbols of a romanticized past, performing their heritage for audiences who preferred their Indians safely contained in Wild West shows and World's Fairs. At the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, Geronimo found himself on display like a museum exhibit, selling photographs for 25 cents and signing autographs for curious visitors who wanted to meet the last Apache warrior. Behind his weathered face and showman's smile, the old medicine man was still planning escape routes back to mountains he would never see again. He dictated his autobiography to a white interpreter, trying to explain Apache ways to a world that had conquered but never understood them. Geronimo died in 1909 at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, still officially a prisoner of war, still dreaming of Arizona sunsets and the sound of wind through desert canyons. His final words, spoken to his nephew, were about returning home. "I should never have surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man alive. But even in death, the old warrior had accomplished something remarkable. He had kept Apache identity alive in the American imagination at precisely the moment when government policies were designed to erase it completely. While Geronimo was performing for crowds, other Apache leaders were quietly mastering an entirely different kind of warfare. On reservations carved from their ancestral territories, they learned to navigate American legal systems with the same strategic brilliance their ancestors had used to survive in the desert. They established tribal governments that appeared to follow American models while preserving traditional methods of consensus building that had sustained Apache communities for centuries. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 provided tools for limited self-governance that clever Apache leaders expanded over the following decades. Where government administrators saw compliance with federal regulations, Apache councils saw opportunities to protect what remained of their sovereignty. They learned to speak the language of American bureaucracy while conducting the real business of their communities, according to older, deeper laws. But the transformation wasn't just political, it was economic. And here's where the story takes a turn that would have amazed both Geronimo and General Miles. When the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988 made casino gaming legal on tribal lands, Apache nations leveraged their hard-won sovereignty into economic engines that generated millions of dollars in revenue. The San Carlos Apache built casinos and luxury resorts that brought wealthy tourists to landscapes their grandparents had defended with Winchester rifles. The very isolation that had once made Apache territories seem worthless to American settlers now became valuable as destinations for people seeking authentic experiences in pristine wilderness. Apache nations found themselves in the enviable position of owning some of the most spectacular real estate in the American Southwest. With the legal sovereignty to develop it on their own terms, casino revenues funded language preservation programs where Apache children learned to speak words their great-grandparents had been beaten for using in government schools. Traditional ceremony grounds were rebuilt and maintained with money that came from slot machines and poker tables. The supreme irony wasn't lost on Apache elders. They were using American gambling addictions to preserve cultural traditions that American policies had tried to destroy. Modern Apache peoples navigate between worlds with a grace their warrior ancestors would recognize as strategic brilliance. Apache soldiers serve in American military units at rates higher than any other ethnic group, channeling their inherited warrior traditions into new kinds of battles in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. The same courage that once drove Apache raiders across desert landscapes now drives Apache Marines through urban warfare and Apache pilots through combat missions over foreign mountains. The Fort Apache Timber Company sustainably manages forests that their ancestors hunted, employing modern forestry techniques that somehow echo traditional Apache relationships with the land. White Mountain Apache youth learn traditional crown dancing, the sacred ceremony that connects dancers to the power of the mountains themselves, while also mastering computer programming and aerospace engineering. The sunrise ceremony, perhaps the most sacred of all Apache traditions, continues to transform young women into changing woman herself, embodying the renewal of all life. But now these ceremonies are documented on smartphones, shared through social media, and attended by Apache relatives who drive hundreds of miles from cities where they work as doctors and lawyers and teachers. The ancient power remains unchanged even as the technology that surrounds it evolves. Before we dive back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Today, when Apache elders gather to tell stories of chiefs who marveled at prison food, they're not speaking of defeat, but of a different kind of victory. Those leaders who said they had never eaten so well as prisoners were acknowledging a terrible price paid for their people's continuation. They were recognizing that survival sometimes requires accepting abundance from former enemies, while never forgetting the cost of that acceptance. Their descendants now choose what to eat from abundance. That would have been unimaginable to warriors who lived on desert Providence. Apache families shop in supermarkets stocked with foods from around the world, but they also choose to remember the taste of mesquite flour and teach their children to gather sage and prepare traditional foods that connect them to landscapes their ancestors called home since time immemorial. Apache nations have become what political scientists call domestic-dependent nations, sovereign governments operating within the borders of the United States but maintaining their own laws, their own citizenship, their own relationships with the land. They issue their own license plates, operate their own courts, manage their own natural resources, and conduct their own international relations with other tribal governments. The Apache Emergency Medical Service employs traditional healers alongside Paramedics trained in the latest emergency medicine techniques. Apache police officers enforce both tribal law and federal statutes, often in situations that require understanding cultural nuances that no police academy could teach. Apache judges apply centuries-old principles of restorative justice to modern legal problems, seeking solutions that heal communities rather than simply punish individuals. Perhaps most remarkably, Apache languages are being revitalized by communities that refused to let them die. Children who might have grown up speaking only English are learning Apache words for plants and animals and weather patterns that connect them to ways of seeing the world that survived conquest, removal, and forced assimilation. Elders who were forbidden to speak their native languages in government, schools are now honored as master teachers in tribally controlled education programs, the greatest victory over those who would have destroyed. Apache peoples is simply this: they still exist. They still speak their languages, still dance their ceremonies, still claim their place in lands their ancestors defended with such fierce determination. They have learned to thrive in the modern world without abandoning the values that sustained them through centuries of survival. In harsh but beloved landscapes, when contemporary Apache leaders look back at the long trail from mountain strongholds to casino boardrooms, they see not a story of defeat and dependency, but one of adaptation and endurance. Their ancestors who ate prison food, while planning impossible escapes, taught them that survival sometimes requires accepting help from unexpected sources, while never abandoning hope for something better. Today's Apache nations represent something unprecedented in human history: indigenous peoples who survived conquest and colonization to emerge as sovereign governments in the modern world, controlling their own destinies while honoring traditions that reach back to time immemorial. They have transformed the abundance that once trapped them in prison camps into tools for cultural preservation and political empowerment. The story that began with Spanish colonizers paying tribute to Apache raiders has come full circle. Now American tourists pay tribute in the form of casino revenues and resort fees to enjoy experiences in Apache-controlled territories. The desert lords, who once struck fear into Spanish hearts, have become leaders of thriving modern nations, masters of technologies their ancestors never imagined, guardians of traditions that connect them to the eternal rhythms of the land they never stopped loving, never stopped calling home.